Today on the Locked On Blues podcast, I have for you guys part 2 of the crossover episode between Locked On Blues and Locked On Wild. If you guys missed part 1, go check it out. It was a lot of fun recording with Seth. He's a great guy. We talked about a lot of stuff in that episode, but today is part 2. We talked about the Central Division as a whole, talked about what teams we think are going to make the playoffs, what teams are going to miss the playoff, gave some fun predictions, tons and tons of content for you guys. We have about an hour in total. Like I said, if you missed yesterday's episode, it gives context for today's. That being said, though, hope you guys enjoy this crossover episode. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube. We are getting so close to 500 subscribers. Really appreciate that. Appreciate all the support, and have a lovely weekend. Enjoy the episode.
Locked On Blues, your daily podcast on the St. Louis Blues. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to part 2 of our crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Blues, part of the Locked On Sports Podcast Network, your teams every day. Thank you for making both Locked On Wild and Locked On Blues your first listen each and every day. And just as a reminder, you can listen to this episode, any episode you want, from any point of time in the show's history for absolutely no charge on your favorite podcast platforms. On today's episode, we are going to finish our 2-part crossover by looking at 3 things that will help each team make a playoff run. 3 things we're concerned about for each team heading into the start of the season, and then we'll talk about how the Central Division looks as well. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild, joined once again by the host of the Locked On Blues podcast, Josh Hyman. Josh, let's dive right into it. This is the happy part of the episode.
Good things?
Yeah, we're doing the good things. And so I don't know if I'll let you, since you're the guest, I'll let you start. Just go 3 things that are going to lead to the Blues having a successful season and making a solid playoff run.
All right. Yeah. I mean, that part's way easier than the 3 concerns. Let's see, which order should I go in? I guess number 1, I think the Blues' strongest asset, if you listen to part 1, the depth. I said it in the last episode. I think that they have around 15, 16 forwards that are going to be competing for the 12 forward spots on during training camp. I think there's 8 or 9 defensemen that are going to be competing for spots in training camp as well. And as we know in the NHL, depth is so incredibly important. Injuries will happen, regression will happen, players will be in and out of the lineup, left and right. Not only that, you can, when you have 4 lines that you can roll out or 3 defensive pairings that you can roll out and be confident in, that's huge. The Blues had 920 goal scorers last year, and that isn't just due to them having 9 great goal scoring players. No, that's due to them having 3 lines of, maybe even arguably 4, of really solid NHLers that tire out the defense. It was what won the Blues a Stanley Cup, was their depth and their grit and their ability to just next man up. I think that's the number 1 thing I'm looking at in terms of success for next season. When players underperform, when players get hurt, next man up. I'm not concerned about that, in the sense that, if someone's out on the first line, then great. It gives a guy like, Jake Neighbors, a rookie, a chance to maybe play some more minutes, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. Number 2, it's a package deal. It's who we talked about last episode, Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou. 2 of the most exciting players, probably the most exciting players I've got to watch since Vladimir Tarasenko's ascension. They're so skilled in their own unique ways. Jordan Kyrou winning the fastest skater, Robert Thomas being able to pass through thread the needle, all that stuff. Both of them are so exciting, and both of them are only getting better. Both of them had their first of hopefully many point per game seasons last year. And if they can step up and be, the guys on this team next year, it's going to turn the Blues from a sort of a 2-way defensive style team to a can't miss hockey, skating up and down the ice, blazing speed, crazy passes. And then finally we might see a Blues team that's sort of looking like the Harlem Globetrotters out there, which is always what I've secretly wanted to see. And then number 3, what I'm optimistic. Number 3 is something that honestly also might be one of my concerns, and that is the fact that in the playoffs against the Colorado Avalanche, we saw a version of Jordan Binnington that we had not seen since he won the Stanley Cup. He looked like an elite tier goalie in the NHL. He looked like he could single-handedly steal a series against the Colorado Avalanche. The Blues were getting outplayed even in the games that they won, but we saw, like I said, a version of Jordan Binnington that we hadn't seen in years, and that was a big concern, was will he ever get to that peak again, or was he a flash in the pan, one-hit wonder? And in that series, we saw that he is capable of playing that elite level of hockey again. And I think he's coming into this next season with a chip on his shoulder after being forced to leave with an injury. He's going to be playing with a lot of confidence, a lot of swagger, a lot of passion. And I think he has a good chance of leading the Blues to a playoff spot. Not single-handedly, but, I think he's going to surprise a lot of people and shut up a lot of doubters along the way.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with any of those three. My list looks a little different, but they're all still very important. Number one, 3 things that will lead to the Wild having a successful season and making a playoff run. I'm not going to go with the one you would think I am going to go with. I'm going with special teams. If the Wild can go from bottom 5 in both categories this past season, which is just, it's hideous.
I didn't even know that.
If you
That's
can
hard
go,
to make it to the playoffs with that as your.
well, and
That's
then
brutal.
it's funny because, you have those numbers and you see what the Panthers did in the postseason where they were like 1 of 31 on the power play, and you're like, well, at least it's not that bad, but still not great. So if the Wild can go from even, and you don't have to make like a huge jump. I'm not saying like bottom 5 to top 5, but even if the Wild can get into, let's just say between 10 and 15 in both categories, that is going to massively help this team, because the final 40 games of the season, the Wild's penalty kill was right around 60%. We're not talking like a 5-game stretch. We're not talking a 10-game stretch. 40 games, the Wild's penalty kill was at 60%. That is basically flipping a coin and saying either we're giving up a power play goal or we are getting a clear. And it seemed like it was even worse than that. So between 10th and 15th is, I think, going to be enough of a jump for both units that the Wild can, take advantage of power plays to where we don't feel like we're just wasting 2 minutes of time, and can actually stop teams from scoring on special teams. If they can do that, that's going to be massive for this team. Number 2, we talked about it in part 1, is the goaltending. If Marc-Andre Fleury can turn the clock back a little bit, and most importantly, if Philip Gustafsson can show a little spark, and I talked about this after the trade with the guys at Locked On Senators, I wonder if Gustafsson benefits from coming to Minnesota and not having the pressure of being the guy. Obviously was kind of the goaltender and waiting for them, and it just didn't necessarily work out. If he comes here and there's not that pressure and he looks good and he, gets on a little bit of a roll, because from what I've heard, the splits that they want to use is they want Fleury to start somewhere around 50 games, which means you're going to have about 30 to 32 that Gustafsson will start. So he's going to get plenty of run as the backup goalie this year. If he shows some promise in those games, I think that's going to be huge, because then you're not going to feel like you have to go to Fleury every night. And if Fleury can go back to even what he was a couple of seasons ago with the Vegas Golden Knights, if he can avoid just, there were a handful of starts for him where he would give up 1 or 2 goals within the first 2 minutes of the game. Did it against Arizona, did it against Seattle down the stretch. If you avoid that, that will go a long way as well. And the third reason that the third thing that will help the Wild make a lengthy postseason run is if the guys we've talked about being the ones that need to fill spots, that need to kind of step up, I'll pivot a little bit. Third reason is if Marco Rossi looks the part and can be a guy who We'd like to see him be one of the Calder finalists, but ultimately, if he just looks like a guy that is capable of being a top 6 center in this league, if he shows that and he shows some flash and some passing ability and some scoring touch, that's going to be huge too, because we like to think that Matt Boldy will take the jump after what we saw in his rookie season. If Rossi can give a similar performance, the Wild have had 3 straight years where they've had somebody that has impressed in their rookie season, and so if he adds to that, this team is going to be in pretty good hands as well. So
There you go.
it's a lot of things, but if they go well, then things are definitely going to go well. So got all the happy out of the way. We'll flip it, and now we'll talk about the flip side of this coin. And so we'll continue our second part of this crossover of Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues after this. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. You can find all the latest football league developments, plus game matchups, news, and podcasts, including the full slate of NFL and college games. BetOnline.net is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite sports and events, including Major League Baseball, MMA, boxing, golf, the NHL, the NBA, anything you can think of, they have you covered. So head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action, which you can find at BetOnline, where the game starts. Continuing our two-parter, part 2 of the crossover between Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues. Once again, thank you for tuning into both shows. We've got you on lock all the way to the start of the season. So make sure you hit subscribe on YouTube. Make sure you follow along so you don't miss out on any info between now and the first games of the year. All right, Josh, it's time for the not so nice. We talked about the things that will lead to these teams making deep postseason runs. So let's flip it to the things that will lead to a disappointing season. And I'll let you start with this one as well.
Yeah, it's funny because there's going to be a bit of crossover between my my 3 things that I'm optimistic about and 3 things that I don't want to say pessimistic about, but 3 things that I guess could go wrong that would lead to a tumultuous season. And the first one is the fact that the Blues had, like I said, 9 20-goal scorers last year. And that is historic. That is so exciting. And honestly, out of those 9 guys, David Perron is gone, so cut it down to 8. Out of those 8 guys, I think realistically, 6 of them might be locks to do it again. You got O'Reilly, Tarasenko, Thomas, Kyrou, Shen. Oh boy, I'm gonna forget someone, and then everyone's gonna yell at me. And the player that I'm forgetting. The top 6, I think, is very, very likely that they could do it again. But then you look at a guy like Ivan Barbashev, and you're like, okay, is that repeatable? Maybe, maybe not. And my worry is the fact that the Blues started out their season winning so many games, like 6-4, 5-3, 7 to whatever, that if the offense starts out not even like cold, but just average, then we could see a team that is a little bit too reliant on that offense, in the sense that the defense is playing a little bit more loose, and then that leads to Jordan Binnington losing confidence, and then the season is lost and gone at that point. I don't think that's going to happen, but my fear is that if the offense doesn't start out as on fire as it did last year, that it could have sort of a domino effect, that the defense isn't as confident and the goaltending isn't as confident. But I still think the Blues have one of the deepest offenses in the NHL. They have, like I said, probably 6 or so guys that I think could surpass that 20-goal mark again, maybe more if Barbashev continues to grow and if they have some rookies break out, stuff like that. So not super concerned about that. My biggest concern for this next offseason is, and I talked about it in the first episode and I kind of alluded to it there, is Jordan Binnington does not have his safety net. Jordan Binnington had a great safety net last year in Ville Husso. Binnington struggled. Husso came in, took over, did a spectacular job as the starter there down the stretch, carried the Blues into the playoffs pretty much, and then Binnington took over again in the playoffs. If Jordan Binnington struggles a little bit and falters and needs a goalie to play, 20 out of 30 games while he figures his stuff out and then jumps back in at the end. Thomas Greiss isn't that guy. If you need Thomas Greiss to play a starting caliber workload for a good chunk of your season, you're going to lose more of those games than you win, in my opinion. So it kind of goes hand in hand with, if the offense struggles and Jordan Binnington struggles as a result, we could see him lose that confidence and lose that aggression that makes him such a good player. And we could be looking at a situation where we're starting Thomas Greiss a heck of a lot more than we wanted to. Again, I'm optimistic about that. I think we saw the best version of Jordan Binnington that we've seen in a long time in those playoffs. And because of that, I don't think that that's super likely. But you never know. And then my third thing, let's see. I'm kind of just going off the cuff here. Third thing that I'm worried about. Well, I guess, it's pretty obvious. The defense was underwhelming pretty much all of last year for the St. Louis Blues. It was straight up bad at the beginning of the year. The defense was bad. Not just not that good. It was bad. It was a point where we were like, oh my God, the Blues can't even make the playoffs with this defense. And then they got Nick Leddy and kind of settled that average. Or I guess average for a playoff team, above average for an NHL team. But they have an average defense on paper, which is fine. But if the defense falters, if the defense has another rough start like they did last year, and you're looking at a top four of Nick Leddy, Torrey Krug, Justin Falk, and Colton Parayko all locked up long term, and you're saying, okay, if anything, we can move one of these guys if we're desperate. But the Blues have locked themselves into a top four that I think is not as good as it could be. That's a fine top four. Is that a Stanley Cup winning top four? Is that comparable to the top four that the Blues had when they won the Stanley Cup? Alex Pietrangelo, Colton Parayko, and Jay Bouwmeester being the big three up there? I don't think so. I think that their Blues defense is by far objectively worse than the defense that they had when they won the Cup. So if the defense plays even a little bit below what's expected of them, the Blues are going to have a bad defense. And that's just a fact, or at least bad in terms of playoff standards. There are teams out there that have really bad defenses, but in a competitive Central Division, and in a Central Division where you're pretty much guaranteed to run into the Colorado Avalanche in round 2 of the playoffs, if you make it there, you need a good defense and you need them to play consistently. And I hope that it doesn't take them too long to get to that point, because once the Blues defense did figure it out and they did gel, they looked good. But you can't really afford half of a season of growing pains out of that defensive unit.
For the Wild's 3, you'd assume that I would just kind of go with the flip side of the 3 that would lead to a good season and a playoff run, but I actually have 3 different ones that I'm going to discuss. So first and foremost, these 3 things will lead to the Wild having a disappointing season. Number 1 is if the Wild do not have the opportunity to use the best defensive line in the NHL, that being the grief line, as we call it. Jordan Greenway, Marcus Foligno, and Joel Eriksson Ek. Jordan Greenway is expected to be out to start the season. Not sure how much time he's going to miss, but he will be out to start the year. Marcus Foligno has missed time the past few seasons due to injury as well. And if you have 2 of those guys on the same line, but not all 3, it is a different product than when you have all 3 of those guys able to do what they do, which is to neutralize top lines offenses of their opponents. If the Wild are not able to use that line as much as they have in the past, that the defense takes a hit. There's no 2 ways about it. And so if that happens, that's going to cause some problems for this team. Again, because if you take Marcus Foligno out of this Wild lineup, it does not hum at the same level that it does with him in the lineup. So if Greenway misses time, if he misses additional time, if Marcus Foligno misses time this year, even if Joel Eriksson Ek misses time, it's a line that just does not function the same. And so if those 3 are not working together, defense takes a hit. So that's the first bullet point that could leave the Wild having a disappointing season. Number 2 is, and this is going to sound weird when I say it, but if the other shoe drops from all of the empty net heroics that the Wild had last season, all of the late comebacks that this team had, to force overtime and then win in overtime, or to just win games outright when they're down by like 2 goals in the third period. If the hockey gods decide that what the Wild did last year with all of that was enough and that bottoms out, that's not going to be super great for the Wild, because I don't even know how many games it was. It was double digits that the Wild were able to complete comebacks in the third period and end up winning games. So let's just say it was 14 games. You change the outcome in those 14 games, and that's a noticeable drop in production. So I'd like to see the team. I love the heroics too. I'm not trying to say that I don't enjoy seeing a 2-goal deficit erased with like a minute to play, but I think it speaks to trying to play a little better to start the game and get to the point where you have a lead and can hold it, as opposed to having to play from behind all the time. If the Wild can avoid kind of falling into that trap, I think that will help them out as well. And then the final one for the Wild, if they have to fill roster spots due to injury outside of the young players that we anticipate in Marco Rossi and Kalen Addison, if they have to go further down in the pool than that, there are players that could be ready to play for the Wild this season, but all of the young prospects are at least a couple of seasons away. So if we're seeing a lot of games played for other guys down in Iowa that are not Marco Rossi or Kalen Addison or a handful of other guys, if they go beyond that, something has gone catastrophically wrong. And so those are the 3 that I'm going with. But obviously there are any number of other things that could go wrong. Injuries, players not having great season. It's a long list, but those are the 3 I'm going with. The good part is that it seems like a lot of the Central Division is kind of riding on that same thing. Like if this happens, we'll be fine. If these things don't happen, we won't. So we're going to play a little game to finish today's episode talking about the Central Division. Yeah, putting you on the spot. I just thought of this. So we'll give it a shot, but we're going to finish by talking about the Central Division as we wrap up this 2-part crossover episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues after this. Final segments of the big 2-parter between Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues, breaking down the offseason, looking ahead to the start of the season. And Josh, we're going to play a game to finish. And basically, it's in or out. So we're going to look at the teams that made the playoffs this past year. And so there's not going to be a whole lot of changes on the other side of the coin. There are a couple of teams that are going to look completely different, and that could either work or it couldn't. And so let's just run down the playoff scope. We'll start, of course, with the Stanley Cup champions, Colorado Avalanche. New goalie combo.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
That would be bananas to start this. Colorado Avalanche, no Darcy Kemper, no Nazem Kadri. Couple of other players that departed as well, but still, it's mostly the same players that we have come to know and kind of be jealous of. So this one seems pretty easy.
Yeah, they're
still.
I got them penciled in at back-to-back cup champs. Maybe it's just because Tampa just did it, but God, they're so good.
I know.
What else can you say other than they're just so good? Like it's an onslaught, no matter what line. Yeah, and losing Nazem Kadri hurts, but like it's the Avalanche. They have like 2-3 top 3 players at their position. You know, Nathan McKinnon is ridiculous. Cale Makar is going to be probably the best defenseman in the league for the next decade. It's like when you have a team that special and that had an absolute cakewalk to the Stanley Cup like they did, like it was never in doubt. It was never in doubt. They're not only are they in, I got them winning the cup again.
I can't argue with that. I mean, it's a really good team. And so we'll go there. We'll leave our 2 teams for last, of course. the Nashville Predators, who made the playoffs this past season. They ended up they ended up not having one of the best goalies probably in the division in the conference for their opening round playoff series against the Colorado Avalanche, and it went exactly how we would expect.
Yeah.
But it seemed like a team that relied a lot, more so than others, on like career years. And if there's one team in this mix who I just don't know if they can get all of that to happen again. And I said this exact same thing last year, and
They proved you wrong.
shocker, they made the playoffs. But hot take, I am saying out on the Nashville Predators. I've been going back and forth on this for the whole offseason. I'm just going to commit to it. I am saying out on the Nashville Predators. So Locked On Predators, if you guys are listening to this, I'm sorry. Let's talk it out. But I'm saying out.
Look, you might have convinced me. I always thought of them as a little bit of like a step below in terms of the Central Division. Like, made the playoffs because another team had to make the playoffs. I think they had to rely on some other teams underperforming almost. Similarly to what like you kind of said about Minnesota too, is like they're relying on a lot of players overperforming, but I think Nashville even more so. But the flip side of that is they probably have a top 5 defenseman in the NHL in Roman Josi. They have a great defensive core. They have good goaltending. So they could be in. I'll play devil's advocate. I think they have the pieces to, even if they have that regression, I think they still make the playoffs just because the Central isn't looking that strong next year beyond the obvious teams. If there's a Central team in the wild card, I think the top 3 is locked in. But depending on how the wild card race goes, I mean, we'll get into it, but there are some teams at the bottom of the division that they're just not making the playoffs. So
no,
Nashville I have in just because someone's got to make it.
Right. And I don't want to single anybody out that's not going to make the playoffs, but the Chicago Blackhawks they're just not. Oh, sorry. I wasn't going to do that, but I did anyway. Dallas Stars. They were in. Same thing as all the other teams. A couple of notable departures, couple of additions. It's so hard to bet against Jason Robertson. He's so good. And Ettinger, if he can do it for a full season, I think I don't know. For whatever reason, it's weird that you would look at the 2 rosters and I would say Nashville is out and then do exactly what I'm about to do and say Dallas is in, but yet here we go.
I might take the opposite approach. I might say Dallas is out just because Tyler Seguin and Jamie Benn are in regression. Tyler Seguin struggled pretty poorly last year. He hasn't looked like his former self in a couple seasons now. Similar to Jamie Benn, they're relying on a young goaltender, which is always hit or miss. And like I said, I think they kind of, like we talked about with the Wild and the Predators, they kind of need a guy like Jason Robertson to have that career year again and not have that sophomore slump, in the sense that teams are figuring him out a little bit more and he won't be able to produce as much. I think they need one of Tyler Seguin or Jamie Benn to return to that superstar form in order for them to make the playoffs. And if that doesn't happen, I don't know if they make it. Because like I said, I don't see a circumstance where teams not named the Avalanche, Blues, or Wild are in that top 3. It's going to be a wild card spot, and I just don't know if Dallas has the consistency to fight in what's going to be a tough wild card race.
Yeah, Dallas is definitely going to need Seguin or Benn to have like a Matt Duchene type year, and that's probably a little too high of a mark, but something like that where you're just like, okay, this guy's clearly just going nuts all year. So yeah, it's not going to surprise me if that goes one way or the other, but it's just because I don't know, for whatever reason, I just look at those rosters and yet I pick the opposite. Let's just gloss through the Pacific. Calgary Flames, wild offseason for them. A lot of changes, and yet you look at that team and they probably won't win the division, but ultimately I think they'll probably still be in the playoff picture by the end of the year.
you could argue, and I'm not saying I believe this, you could argue that they got better. And
You
like,
could.
I'm not saying it's the truth, but how often do you see a team lose its two top scorers and have an argument that they got better? I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying they objectively did, but it's if you're a Flames fan, like this offseason must have been an absolute roller coaster. You go from losing Gaudreau, losing Kachuk, but all of a sudden you get a new superstar in Huberdeau, you get a really underrated defenseman in Uyghur. Like, they've always been such a frustrating team to play against too.
Yeah.
Even when they're on paper not as good as they were last year, they've always just been a team that never quits, that wins games that maybe they don't deserve to win. You take your foot off the gas against the Calgary Flames, and all of a sudden they've tied it up again and stuff like that. So I can't sleep on them. Plus, I love their jerseys, so I want to see those jerseys in the playoffs.
Yeah, that's a great point. Edmonton Oilers, I think they've
And
solved the goalie position. Yeah, I can't. I can't
I
make a
mean,
case that I'm not.
have they solved the goalie position? Probably not, because it's the Edmonton Oilers.
That is the thing too. Of all the teams who finally address a problem, the team that's going to have it not work is for sure Edmonton. Like, if there's going to be anybody that just combusts, it's going to be the Oilers, because
Yep.
there's just no more outside of Minnesota. There's no more snake bitten franchise or just team. Minnesota's got 4 of them. There's just no more snake bitten team than the Edmonton Oilers, but
Yep.
they'll make it.
They have the best hockey player on the planet, and he's only going to keep getting better. And they might have where do you put Draisaitl? I don't know. I'm not giving my ranking. That's a little too much of a hot take. But you have another top 5 player on the planet, and they're unstoppable they made it to the Western Conference Finals. Look, did they get walked by Colorado? Yeah, but so did pretty much every other team.
Yeah, so did a lot of
And
people.
they have Connor McDavid. You got Connor McDavid. I don't care what the rest of your team looks like. And if they did figure out their goaltending position, watch out. That's all I'm saying.
And then Los Angeles Kings, as weird of a year as they had, I feel like they gotta be in, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think they're at the point where your rebuild kind of turns into a successful team once again. I think they're a really good example of a team that did a rebuild right. They didn't fall into the trap of the Detroit Red Wings or the Chicago Blackhawks. Well, they kind of did, where they gave guys a little bit too much money, but they got out of it well. They have a pretty young team. I think they're in.
And then the final team, and I wanted to do this 100% just because I felt the need. A team that I think we can both agree is probably definitely out, maybe definitely out. The Vegas Golden Knights.
Flew too close to the sun.
Anytime you can
they
give,
shouldn't be.
Who knows?
Like, you look at their roster on paper, and it's like, what happened? You had a Stanley Cup team, and then you just wanted more. You just needed to get closer and closer to the sun. You go out, you get Jack Eichel, you stack up your team, and you forget about depth and prospect and picks. But at the same time, it's the same argument as the Edmonton Oilers. You're that top heavy. That should at least earn you a playoff spot. They should have made the playoffs last year. They just underachieved. They were dysfunctional. I don't know if it's just a matter of too many egos in that locker room or whatever it may be, but it's like, you look at that team and you look at how far they, rose right away, and then now how far they've fallen. It's like, even if they've lost a bunch of good players, it's like they shouldn't be that bad. But expectations are too high, I think.
Yeah. It's like that. It's like somebody is in Vegas and they call you and they're like, "Hey, I'm going to need you to pay for a plane ticket for me." And you're like, "What happened? Did you extend yourself a little too much at the blackjack table?" And they're like, "I don't want to talk about it."
Yep.
That's the Vegas Golden Knights.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And the best part about that is that it could be completely wrong once the season starts.
It could be, and everyone that's listening can yell at us and add us on Twitter and be like, "You dummies! You said that this team was going to be good, and they weren't," or vice versa.
Keep the receipts. Dallas fans, I'm sure, will, or Nashville fans, I'm sure, will keep the receipts on me saying that they won't make the playoffs. But we're not all perfect, so that's where we'll leave it. And I think that's a perfect spot to wrap up this two-part.
Well, actually, I just
Perfect spot to wrap up this
well,
two-part.
actually, I just want to say definitely
sure.
out. Chicago Blackhawks.
Thank you. I was going to do that anyway and forgot. And so,
Yeah.
thanks for the assist. Got it in there. Yeah. Chicago's not making the playoffs.
No.
So there you have it. We'll mic drop from there. Thank you for tuning into our two-part crossover of Locked on Wild and Locked on Blues. Make sure you hit subscribe on YouTube, follow wherever you listen, because we will keep you up to date on both the Wild and the Blues the rest of the offseason, into the season as well. So make sure to tune in and keep up to date with us. You can find both shows as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. New episodes all week long. Thanks for tuning in.